In the dusty back room of a small house, a group of men gathered. The leader, Carlos, laid out the blueprint of the Banco Central. They had been planning for over a year, collecting tools, information, and allies. No detail could be left to chance. The heist would take place in the dead of night. Late at night, the sound of metal on stone echoed through the abandoned building. Antonio, the tunnel expert, worked tirelessly with his team. They dug through the earth inch by inch, careful not to make a sound. The air was thick with dust, and sweat dripped from their brows. The days slipped by as the heist neared. Carlos and his crew spent the time preparing their escape routes and securing their disguises. They met regularly to discuss every detail. On the eve of the heist, they stood in a circle, all eyes on Carlos. "Tomorrow night," he said, "we'll make history." The night of the heist arrived. The crew, dressed in black, made their way to the abandoned building. The air was thick with humidity, and the city seemed unusually quiet. As the clock struck midnight, they were ready. Antonio, along with two others, entered the tunnel. Inside the tunnel, Antonio and his men worked quickly. Their tools scraped against the earth, carving out a path toward the vault. They were nearly halfway there. The heat inside the cramped space was unbearable, but they pressed on. Every so often, they paused to listen for any noise above ground. After hours of digging, the tunnel reached the vault's outer wall. Antonio's crew stood silent for a moment, taking in their progress. They had made it. They were now within inches of one of the largest caches of money in Brazil. Antonio wiped his brow, his heart racing. The hole was now large enough for them to peek inside. Antonio's eyes widened as he saw the stacks of money, some stacks so high they seemed to touch the ceiling. It was more than they had imagined. The vault was even more secure than they had expected, but the money was within their grasp. Just as they filled the first bag, a low buzzing sound echoed through the vault. The silent alarm was active, but only a few seconds had passed. Antonio's heart raced. They couldn't afford to panic. "Keep moving," he whispered. The buzz continued, growing louder, but they couldn't stop now. The sound of sirens grew louder as police cars raced down the street. They weren't close yet, but they were coming. Antonio's crew was still working feverishly, stuffing cash into bags as quickly as they could. They were nearly done, but the pressure was mounting. The crew quickly moved toward the tunnel entrance, their bags heavy with stolen money. They had accomplished what no one thought possible, but their escape wasn't guaranteed. With the bags secured, the crew sprinted through the tunnel, hearts pounding in their chests. They emerged from the tunnel into the darkness of the alleyway. The getaway cars were parked just down the street, engines running. Carlos was already inside one, waiting for the crew. They moved quickly, loading the bags of money into the vehicles. There was no room for error. As the getaway car sped through the streets, flashing lights appeared in the rearview mirror. The police had seen them. Carlos cursed under his breath. "Don't stop for anything," he ordered. The car weaved through traffic, narrowly avoiding collisions as the police closed in. After an intense and harrowing chase, the crew finally reached the safe house. It was a remote, unassuming house on the outskirts of the city. Carlos had arranged for a quiet refuge where they could lay low for a while. The crew unloaded the bags of money, their faces flushed with excitement. The next morning, the news spread like wildfire. The Banco Central had been robbed, and the authorities were in a frenzy. News channels broadcasted footage of the vault, showing the massive amounts of money that had been stolen. The police had no leads. It seemed like the criminals had vanished. Weeks passed, and the authorities were no closer to catching the crew. But then a break came. One of the bags of stolen money was found in a hidden compartment of a bus station locker. The police were able to trace it back to a member of the crew. They now had their first clue. As the investigation grew more intense, Carlos decided it was time to split up the crew. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. Each man was assigned a different location to lay low. Some of the crew members left Fortaleza altogether, blending into the larger cities nearby. Months after the heist, rumors began to circulate that the crew had already spent the money. There were stories of lavish lifestyles, exotic vacations, and expensive purchases. The police couldn't confirm anything, but they knew that if the robbers hadn't spent the cash by now, they never would. Carlos knew that time was running out. The crew's former hideouts had been discovered and the authorities were closing in. It was only a matter of time before they were caught. He called the remaining members of the crew together for one last job, one last attempt to disappear completely. The crew managed to find a buyer for the remaining money, someone who didn't ask too many questions. They met in a secluded location, exchanging cash for goods. The transaction was smooth, but there was a sense of finality to it. The crew had made their money, but at what cost? With the money gone and the crew scattered, the authorities finally managed to piece together the pieces. Through careful investigation, they tracked down every member of the crew. It was a slow and methodical process, but one by one, they were brought in for questioning. One by one, the remaining crew members were arrested. Carlos, who had been living under a new identity, was caught in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a shock to him, but he knew the risk of being on the run. The crew had lasted longer than expected, but their time was up. The trial was a spectacle, with news outlets covering every moment. The men were charged with theft, conspiracy, and a host of other crimes. The courtroom was packed, and tensions ran high as the details of the heist were revealed. The public was captivated by the daring nature of the robbery. After weeks of hearings, the verdict was finally delivered. The crew was found guilty on all charges. The sentences were harsh, but they had expected nothing less. Carlos, the mastermind, was sentenced to decades in prison. Some of the crew members were given shorter sentences. Months passed and life slowly returned to normal in Fortaleza. The Banco Central recovered from the heist. Though the memories lingered, the city had been shaken, but it had also been impressed by the boldness of the criminals. The authorities were praised for their work in bringing the crew to justice. Even as the years passed, the story of the Banco Central heist remained in the public's imagination. Books were written, documentaries were made, and the heist became a symbol of both audacity and tragedy. Some remembered the crew as daring criminals, while others saw them as villains. Though the authorities had captured most of the crew, some questions remained unanswered. Did any of the stolen money ever make it into the hands of the criminal underworld? Were there any accomplices still free, hiding in plain sight? The authorities continued to investigate. In the years following the heist, rumors continued to circulate about the fate of the remaining crew. Members, some believed that they had escaped to other countries, living their lives in luxury under new identities. Others whispered that some of them had never been caught at all. If you like it, please like and subscribe to the channel to receive all that is new.